Japanese role-playing games led by Nokkvi from Birds of Play and the University of Iceland. Let's go ahead and open up the Zoom client. And we will get started as soon as our host lets us in.
Okay, welcome everybody to our presentation today. So this session is being presented by Nokkvi, who is a game researcher coming to us from the University of Iceland. He also runs the Birds of Prey YouTube channel and is an active scholar of JRPGs, which are Japanese role-playing games. And today he's going to talk to us about kind of JRPGs, academic and popular perspectives. So I'll just give it to you, Nokkvi. Thank you so much for being here.
Yep, thank you very much. So I'm just going to take a second to pull up my slides real quick. Hopefully everybody can hear me. And if not, then be sure to let me know. Oh, I love having an interpreter. It's a dream.
You are coming in loud and clear.
It looks good to me, Nokkvi.
Okay. So, like I said, I'm coming to you from Iceland. It's the middle of the evening now, and we are expecting a volcanic eruption any minute now. So if you get lucky, we will be able to spice up the presentation with a little bit of an earthquake maybe, but we'll see. But if not, I hope that my talk is going to be interesting enough by itself. So the title of my talk is going to be Japanese role-playing games, academic and popular perspectives. And I think I'm just going to try to get right into it. And so what I hope to achieve today is to offer you some insight into the academic as well as popular perspectives on JRPGs or Japanese role-playing games. And at the end, I hope to leave you with the impression not that I'm an amazing person, even though that's usually how I try to engage with people, but rather that there are in fact amazing things yet to be done in regard to the study of Japanese role-playing games or just games in general, and that I believe that these things will be done in very different ways by a lot of different people. And that's an opportunity for you, if you're interested, to let your voice be heard and to take part in a conversation that I think is not only exciting to see unfold, but also necessary, considering that video games have become such a large portion of our cultural landscape, or are occupying such a large portion of our cultural landscape. So, just a little bit about me. Like I said, my name is Nokkvi Bjarnason, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Iceland, where I'm currently enrolled in cultural studies, although that is basically just a formality since we don't have game studies here in Iceland. I'm the only person that I know of that is actively pursuing an academic career in game studies. So even though I'm enrolled in cultural studies, I'm actually studying and researching games within the academic field of game studies, and with a focus on Japanese games and gaming culture. I have a background in comparative literature, Japanese language and culture, and theory of practical publishing, and all of these things sort of inform what I'm doing, both in regard to my academic career, in quotes, and my work as a YouTuber. So my academic career so far, I like to sort of think that my academic career really started in 2019 when I started writing in English. And this is a point that I also want to mention because, as you might be able to hear, I'm not actually a native English speaker. So I'm really envious of people that come from places that have languages that have a sort of large group of people that can speak the language. We only have about 350,000 people in Iceland. And so even if you're doing great work, there's not a lot of people that are able to enjoy it or appreciate it. So if you are a native English speaker or just speak Spanish or any other big language, then that's an opportunity for you to make yourself heard. And I really hope that you make the most of it if that is something you want to do. But I've entered the English academic world, or maybe you could even call it the international world of academia. And it's been great fun to speak with other academics about these subjects. I've been sort of isolated, and even just this talk is a part of me kind of getting out there, and it's a real honor to be able to do so. But nowadays, as a researcher, I'm almost exclusively focusing on Japanese games, even though as an Icelandic researcher, I had done some other kind of work. And the work I have been doing, or have already done, mainly focuses on the questions of genre, media ecology. And when I talk about media ecology, I'm talking about the sort of media landscape of Japan, in the sense that how do games, anime, manga, and all these different things sort of work together. And lastly, issues of hardware. And my PhD thesis is centered on this idea of sort of national game studies, which I will be talking about a bit later as well. And all of this, the framework for this sort of academic publication thing, is sort of characterized by a really slow process. And the feedback you get from submitting to peer-reviewed journals and stuff is very detailed, but limited in the sense that it's not from a lot of people. And in comparison, I'm also doing this thing, and I have these curtains opening very majestically here. So I also have this thing, and this is my YouTube channel, which I run with my brother, and it's called Birds of Play. And it's a YouTube channel dedicated to the study and the appreciation of Final Fantasy, which is one very prominent franchise within the JRPG genre. And I've been doing this since the 17th of June this last year, and it's great fun. And one of the ways it differs from the sort of academic stuff I'm doing is that I'm publishing a video weekly, and I'm getting feedback right away, which is very different from academia, where I take a long time writing, and then it takes a long time to get feedback, and then just the whole publication process can take a year or more. So this has been great fun, and it's a very interesting medium to sort of discuss these sort of things, because I think we often think about academia and stuff that is being done at the university level or something as sort of more true or more real than these sort of more journalistic or popular approaches to cultural production. But I think that there's a lot of very important work being done there as well, and I wanted to be a part of that as well. But starting with a sort of more academic perspective, I want to talk a little bit about the framework or the establishment that have been set up that enable this sort of study. So firstly, I don't know how familiar you are with game studies as an academic discipline, but the academic field of game studies is something that has emerged as an independent field that is dedicated to the study of games. And this is something that happens at the turn of the century. And we can see this really coming into its own with the publication of dedicated peer-reviewed journals, conferences, regular conferences, and university programs, even though these university programs aren't all that widespread. For example, we don't have a game studies university program in Iceland, which is the reason I'm in cultural studies. But game studies is a relatively young field, and especially in the early years, it was characterized by a sort of gold rush where people were rushing in to sort of talk about these really pioneering ideas that hadn't been put to paper before, and sort of defining the field, defining the epistemological boundaries of the field, what the object of study really was, and stuff like that. And even though that kind of stuff is still possible, people have sort of moved away from it, not necessarily because there is a consensus or people agreed that the answer had been found, but rather they just kind of got sick of it then, because there are so many other things to do. And that's where the diversification of the field really comes in, and these subfields emerge. And one subfield that I am especially interested in now is, or a potential subgenre of game studies, is this idea of national game studies. And national game studies is game studies that is concerned with games as representative of local as opposed to global forces. So we could maybe just call it local game studies, but the reason that I refer to it as national game studies is that the way this kind of study historically emerges within game studies is by looking at how certain nation states, directly or indirectly, are producing games. And in this context, Japan is occupying a very privileged position. A lot of the study that's being done on national game studies or local game studies is being done on Japanese games. And maybe understandably so, like if we just look at movies and the cultural output globally, where it is often just West versus the rest, Japan has set itself up as a sort of contender to the West. So it's Japan versus the West in some sense, at least, especially at a particular point in time, that this paradigm might be changing. But we can see that this is being studied with various book publications, journalistic and academic. And then we also have Replaying Japan, which is a yearly conference and also publishes an academic journal. And this is the only journal that I know of that focuses on national games, or just like the game production of one country and the culture of gaming. Like we do have, of course, articles and stuff written about, for example, first-person shooters and how they might be representative of some sort of culture from the United States, but we don't have dedicated journals, at least not to my knowledge. But so this is sort of special in that regard. So here we have my major JRPG or Japanese role-playing game publications. And I was thinking just to give you a little bit of an insight into what I have been doing, not necessarily in order for you to fully grasp my ideas, but more so that you can understand what purpose they serve in the wider context of game studies, or what I think they signify. The fact that these kind of articles can get published within game studies. So starting with this one, A Fantasy Without a Dream, Japanese Role-Playing Games and the Absence of the Expressive Ideal. This is an article where I examine the historical trajectory of Japanese role-playing games, and I do it in comparison to their Western counterparts. And in order to do that, I first had to sit down and I had to sort of formulate a framework for the study of the genre. And in order to do that, I had to understand the building blocks of the JRPG genre. And I did that by looking at the sort of academic and popular genre definitions, like how genre is being talked about in the context of game studies, as well as film studies and literature, and then also how people generally talk about Japanese role-playing games and Western role-playing games, because ultimately genre is a question of experience and how people understand the world and how they categorize the world. And I came up with these three subcategories or three pillars of JRPG-ness or role-playing game-ness, which are the thematic, systematic, and expressive. The thematic has to do with the sort of motifs and iconography. So like it often has to do with this medieval setting, and then it expands into science fiction and stuff like that. One of the problems with just recognizing role-playing games by using the thematic is that a lot of other different game types have also adopted these themes. And then we have systematic elements such as leveling up systems and other systems that are very common in role-playing games. And then, but we also see that other games have also adopted role-playing game elements. And then lastly, we come to the expressive. And when I talk about the expressive here, I'm not talking about the opportunity for developers to really express themselves, but rather the opportunity for players to express themselves. And in what way do games afford players the opportunity to have agency in the game and to affect what happens in the game using their own motivations. So, and it is this sort of, and this expressive dimension also occupies a privileged position, I think, in the hierarchy of these three different pillars. One reason is because, for example, in Dungeons and Dragons, the thematic and the systematic are thought of as being subservient to the expressive. Like if the rules are getting in the way of players expressing themselves, or if the setting is getting in the way of players expressing themselves, then these things should lose out to the expressive dimension. And this is very important, especially in Western role-playing games, I think. And that's something that we might all have a feeling for if we are familiar with these games, but I will mention that a bit later. So I then examined how JRPGs and Western role-playing games can conform differently to these criteria, not just as separate entities, but as separate entities in time. So you can sort of see the historical development. And then I throw in two different forms of the expressive ideal that we can trace back to the early beginnings of game studies that have sort of been pushed to the side. The first one being the Aleph, and the second one being the holodeck, the Aleph being the sort of symbol that is capable of producing infinite other symbols. So it's like a text that produces more text. And then the holodeck is the holodeck from Star Trek, and it's the idea that the ultimate goal of games should be us being able to enter them and experience these immersive worlds that react to everything we do. And these ideals were something that were discredited due to their utopian nature, sort of. But what I talk about in this article is that even though they have been discredited academically, they have nevertheless, they seem to have served as a roadmap or an ideal to strive for in the West more than in Japan, where the West has sort of tried to emulate the creativity that Dungeons and Dragons afforded by using a very human game master, while Japanese role-playing games focused more on just telling a story and using the system to move that story along. So JRPGs seem to have distanced themselves from these ideals to a larger extent than Western role-playing games. And now we come to what this actually is. So this is basically, I think, just me putting the common knowledge, in quotation marks, into an academic context. So you're very likely to have heard, if you are invested in these sort of games, that Western role-playing games are about choices and Japanese role-playing games are about story. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about that this is a very new field, and there's a lot of things we can still do that are yet to be done. So we still have room, and that something like this get published signifies that there is still room for this definitional or foundational discussion about these really basic things. And even though they're basic, it doesn't mean they are we should take them for granted. And that's where the academic process comes in. But this is what I want to show you, that something that this gets published is meaningful in itself, despite whether it's a good answer to the question. So next we're going to this one, a recipe for disaster, the emerging ludomix and the outsourcing of narrative. So this article examines the concept of the ludomix The Ludo mix is a new term that was proposed at the for the DIGR conference of 2009 that took place in Kyoto, Japan. And it's basically a multimedia or transmedia franchise media mix in the Japanese context that has a game at the center of it, that has a game at the center or at the top of the hierarchy. And the way I examined the Ludo mix was by taking the Final Fantasy 15 universe, so just not Final Fantasy 15 the game, but the Final Fantasy 15 universe, as it was called, which includes many more games and DLC episodes and a movie and books and manga and all this different stuff. And I examined the Ludo mix, and I posited that the Ludo mix is something that exists at the intersection of traditional media mix or transmedia strategies and game development. So both of these things are evolving over time. Media mix strategies are evolving and game development is evolving. And in order to understand how games like Final Fantasy fit into all this, we have to look at both of these things together. And together, they seem to, in this particular instance, they seem to have resulted in the outsourcing of Final Fantasy 15's narrative to outside the ludic sphere or outside the game itself. So I don't know how familiar you actually are with Final Fantasy 15, but one of the major points of criticism was that its story seemed to be somewhat lacking, which is a very harsh piece of criticism directed at a Final Fantasy game that is often enjoyed mainly for the story. So this thing affected the critical reception of the game very negatively. And the common knowledge that this is putting into an academic context, I think, even though I'm simplifying quite a lot, I think. So it's saying that books are easier to produce than games. That's the easy way to say it, because we see that there is a sort of hierarchy within the Ludo mix, within the media ecology of Japan, wherein certain incentives have led to the developers of Final Fantasy 15 finding it appealing to break their narrative down and distribute it between different media. And for example, when the last DLC episodes of Final Fantasy 15 were ultimately cancelled, they ended up just making a book instead. And so using the idea of the Ludo mix as a framework, we can better understand the disproportionate load that is imposed on media via these sort of transmedia collaborations. That's that. And then we have this one. This actually isn't published yet. This is a chapter in a book that is coming out this year, I think. And it's a book dedicated to the study of Japanese role-playing games. And if you're interested in the academic study of Japanese role-playing games, look forward to this book. And I just write one chapter. It's a collection of articles. And this chapter of mine is examining the sort of hardware preferences and how they have shaped the development of the genre. And what I mean by hardware preferences is that the Japanese role-playing games, for example, have mainly been developed for consoles as opposed to the PCs or personal computers. And it's very interesting because these different platforms, they have sort of different cultural connotations, and they also evolve very differently. So, for example, about the cultural connotations, consoles, just like the Nintendo Famicom or the Nintendo Family Computer, which in English would be the Nintendo Entertainment System, the original Nintendo computer, which confused mothers for years to come, thinking that every game was a Nintendo game. So yeah, and a family computer, so it's intended for everyone. While PCs in Japan, just like in other places, they were more expensive and they were also just more difficult to operate. So they attracted a more hardcore or nerdy crowd even. And how this maybe affects Japanese role-playing games is that Japanese role-playing games make the move to console a lot earlier than Western role-playing games. And they do that in part in power of the media ecology of Japan. So they use the already accepted media of anime and manga. For example, Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest is often thought of as being the first Japanese role-playing game. And Dragon Quest uses this, hired the same artist that does Dragon Ball. So it's, the name is similar for a reason, Akira Toriyama. And in doing so, they brought role-playing games to the public, into the mainstream, and sort of popularized the genre much earlier than it was popularized here in the West. In the West, we could maybe look at the publication of films such as The Lord of the Rings, or the success of the Lord of the Rings trilogy as a start of the sort of role-playing games and fantasy elements being truly accepted by the mainstream, and not just in these sort of nerd or circles. And these computers also have very different evolutions. The evolution of consoles being very sporadic, so you have these generations. PlayStation 5, for example, is meant to signify a significant leap from PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 3 before it. And even though these terms are often like posted or pushed forth as sort of marketing stunts, for example, their case has been made that there isn't actually all that much difference in the terms of the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in terms of hardware power. So it's also just our idea of it. But the idea is that we are leaping forward in terms of technological power. And as games on these consoles, and now I'm talking sort of specifically about the Final Fantasy series, it has seen the interests of console manufacturers and game developers such as those that make for the Final Fantasy series. Their interests have aligned in the sense that Sony benefits from Final Fantasy showing like the best that the hardware can do and stuff like that. And in this sense, JRPGs have sort of emphasized visuals. And if they haven't emphasized visuals in this way, they often do it by using anime in the same sense as Dragon Quest. So this is a sort of historical analysis that is concerned with the idiosyncrasies of Japanese role-playing games, and just goes to show that Japanese role-playing games have often been symbiotic with the mass appeal of consoles, and that the mass appeal of consoles has attributed to the mass appeal of Japanese role-playing games and vice versa. So that's enough about that. If you have any questions about this, just read the articles. No, you can ask me later, of course. So now moving on to YouTube, or the popular framework as I have called it. So there are a lot of distribution channels for the sort of more popular discussion about these sort of things. We have YouTube, we have Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And what unifies all of these channels in terms of what's being discussed is a community. And this is maybe the thing that surprised me the most, because even though I'm you could probably say, hardcore Final Fantasy fan, I had never really been a part of the Final Fantasy fandom until I started the Birds of Play YouTube channel. And it's really interesting, not only as a fan, but also as a researcher, to sort of take part in the sort of discourse and the rhetoric that is taking place about not only Final Fantasy, but Japanese role-playing games in general. And I'm looking forward to seeing more of that. And here we have a very loaded slide. We have the Birds of Play YouTube channel. And oh my God, what is that subscribe button? I guess you have to subscribe. No, you choose. You decide. If you're interested in Final Fantasy, you're welcome, and I would love to see you. And I can also see the subscriber count rise or fall in real time, and I actually lost a subscriber just before this talk started, so my serotonin levels are very low at the moment. Oh, I'm just kidding. Okay, so my wife has to leave now. Okay, so the Birds of Play YouTube channel is set up, and the mission statement is that we are studying Final Fantasy in order to deepen our understanding of these games and our appreciation of the games themselves. So when I entered game studies in Icelandic many years ago and was reading game studies from abroad, one of the things that struck me is that there wasn't a lot of scholarship pertaining to just to games themselves and sort of in order to deepen our understanding of games themselves, and that is still sort of the case. A lot of scholarship, or the vast majority of scholarship, actually uses games to tell us something more profound about games or gaming in general, and that's totally fine. But this then is an outlet for me to actually just talk about the games themselves in order to understand them better and enjoy them better. And I do this in at least 3 different ways. So this was sort of the original idea for the channel, just to be a sort of hardcore game studies channel, and I was going to analyze games, and it was going to be no different from my academic work. And then I figured that nobody wants to see that. So I tried to be a little bit more fun as well. And the video here at the top, Final Fantasy VII, The Evolution of Environmental Criticism, which really sounds like a hoot. This was the first video that I scripted, or I wrote down a script for. And then I presented it to my brother, and he said, "You're so boring, brother." And then we figured we have to go in a sort of different direction just in order to reach people. Because I think this is something that people might be interested in once they know who you are and once they have gotten to know you a bit. Final Fantasy X-2 and the Death of God. That sounds like a party. But oh well. This seems to be a lot more popular. To inform people, to tell people about news, and to tell people about maybe lore or stuff like that. But these are by far our most popular videos. And in these videos, we take just gaming trailers, newly released gaming trailers, and I analyze the Japanese in them, and I look at the English trailer, and I check out the differences. And this is by far this is a lot more popular. I'll show you some numbers in a second. And then our mission is also just to entertain and to sort of enjoy being fans, and to but even when we talk about that, for example, I don't know if you've played Final Fantasy IX, but in the video "Why Did Zidane Touch Dagger's Butt?" It's actually a lot more philosophical than the title suggests. I go into the philosophy of lying and stuff like that. So even when I'm trying to entertain, I'm also trying to sort of be educational, or to offer some value, and to think about these games in deep and meaningful ways as far as I'm able to. And I'm the blue one, by the way. So here are 2 videos. The one on the right is the first video I scripted, and the one on the left is the Japanese trailer differences for Final Fantasy 16, which a lot of people are very hyped about. And here we can see sort of differences in reach and differences in how many people are actually watching these videos. So the Japanese trailer differences has 2,800 views approximately, and Final Fantasy VII video has 271 views. And so it's almost tenfold the amount of views. And this, of course, at least for a beginning channel, really affects your strategy moving forward. So it's really interesting how the platform is able to influence what you want to do. like of course you're free to just be yourself, and I think that's what we do, but we sort of prioritize what we are doing in what order by looking at stuff like this. So we are shaped by the platform to some degree. We have to consider searchability, and that's where the new games come in as well, because that's our sort of entryway into being searchable, because YouTube is a search engine in addition to being a video provider or distribution service. And if the video is about something current, then people might be searching it. But usually, because I'm talking about the Final Fantasy series, which the first game got released in 1987, which is incidentally the same year I was born. So we are talking often about games that are more than 20 years old. And it's really amazing that these sort of games still have a dedicated audience. But in order to reach a lot of people, we still have to think about what's current. And we also have to think about length, but I don't really think about length all that much. Like YouTube wants people to stay on the platform for a long time, but I prefer making this sort of short, well, not necessarily short, but condensed videos. Instead of making a hour video about something, I try to condense it into 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. So just in closing, I just want to say again that the cultural landscape of video games is filled with opportunities for study if you want to go the academic path, discussion like in an academic context or on YouTube or wherever, and innovation. And these are all things that you can contribute to if you have a mind to do it, if you want to do it. And it's not just something that people want to see, it's something that I believe we need to see more of. And I'm very excited about being a part of that conversation moving forward. So, any questions?
You can put your questions in the chat, but you can also unmute yourself or turn on your video if you have a question.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I think there are a lot of different influences. One of them being that of course, it creates different and multiple entryways into the game. So a person can pick up the movie, a person can pick up the manga or novel and become interested in the game itself. But I think in this case, it might have been incentivized by necessity, because we can see the cost of sort of, not necessarily necessity, but it became very appealing in this particular climate wherein game development is exponentially becoming less manageable. It's becoming more and more expensive to make games, and this is a time where Square Enix was still working with their own engine, or was having great problems or difficulties with their own engine. So because we can see parts of the game that were originally intended to be in the game being outsourced to the films, and then later we can see how the last DLC is scrapped and turned into a novel. So yeah, I'm probably missing something, but I break it down in the article about these different incentivizers. So I hope that answers your question. Mhm. Uh, I think visuals become very important very early on. In Dragon Quest, or Dragon Warrior, like I said, they hire Akira Toriyama, and it's a very big thing, and it connects very strongly to manga and anime, and the sort of vibrant look of that. And then Final Fantasy comes along, and they get Amano, the guy who did this beautiful painting in the background here. So they are, which is very different, and it's sort of the reason that Final Fantasy isn't as anime inspired as the other ones. It is anime inspired to a large extent, but not as much as these purely anime games. So yeah, visuals become very important very early on, I think, and that just escalates as the processing power becomes more and more. So, and especially with the advent of the PlayStation and Final Fantasy VII, you just get these uh, huge emphasis on cinematics, and also because these cinematics and these pre-rendered cinematics is what maybe shows, even though it doesn't genuinely show the processing power of the hardware itself, it's very good for advertisements and to show a compelling side of your game without having to play it, because that's also one of the difficulties of advertising games, that you can't just, aside from demos and stuff like that. Yeah,
But
thank you.
we do have a question in the chat. I'll go ahead and read it very quickly here. Pamela mentions, I'm really interested in the push and pull between fans and game creators. I'm curious if you feel that the Ludomix gives fans stronger influence in future game development directions, as well as how many game creators may control to what extent fans participate. Could you speak more to this?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that the Ludomix or just media mix strategies in general tend to do is that you see the same series or the same franchise unfolding over a period of time, and that gives game developers, as was the case in Final Fantasy 15, it gives game developers the time or the opportunity to engage with their fans about what they would like to see next. For example, in Final Fantasy 15, you had these surveys about which DLC episodes fans wanted to see prioritized and stuff like that. That's how games may control to what extent fans participate. Yeah, and this framework of time gives, I think, game developers the opportunity to let fans interact with them, but it's of course up to them. I think it's they use it in different ways. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yes, do we have any more questions that you would like to put out? You can unmute yourself, unmute your video and ask it yourself, or you can place it in the chat area here.
Yes, I have a question. So,
Go
but near the beginning, you were talking about how there's not much on like academics. Could you speak more about like what kind of research has been done for video games and learning and that kind of connection?
It's a big question. And I sadly lack the expertise to really answer it. All I can do is talk about what I have contributed to that field. I published an article last year about playing as traveling and how games as a sort of medium for travel can be a platform for education, and that's something that's online, but I'm having difficulties sort of summarizing it. But it's sort of borrowing traditional ideas about travel and what travel means to us, because we have different ways of travel. We have this sort of mass tourism that is often discredited, but we also have this transformational idea about travel, which is a very historic concept. Like we can trace it all the way back to the Odyssey and stuff like that, where we see people returning from their travels, a new man. Well, not Odysseus' son. He's changed, but Odysseus just wanted to get home actually. So travel can be meaningful and not meaningful, and by looking at and by engaging meaningfully or actively with games as travel or as venues for travel, we sort of open up a gateway in order for us to make game playing a transformative experience. So hopefully that gives you something.
Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you.
No problem.
There was a comment posted in the chat about attendees can check out the International Journal of Role Playing with a link that is in the chat there. And then also we have placed an evaluation for this session. So before you completely log out, please click on the evaluation, give us a little bit of feedback and help us with our programming and other things here at Trinity River. Any other questions before we come to a close? We don't want to force you to ask questions, but we don't want to hold you if you don't have any questions.
Since we're talking about, since we are, like, give me 1 second.
The joys of at-home work. So as our presenter comes right back, Matthew Morrison just posted a bibliography of scholarly studies on RPGs, of course, role-playing games. So we do have that in the chat. Yes, you are back. I was stalling for you.
Like, since we're on the topic of books, I just ran and grabbed 2. Like, or if you're interested in role-playing games, I have to recommend this book here. It's a role-playing game studies reader, and it's by the same people that are responsible for the Journal of role-playing game studies, or whatever it was called. And then just one book about Japanese game studies in particular, Atari to Zelda by Mia Gonzalo. It's actually autographed, but yeah, that I didn't manage to grab anything more.
Well, I think with that, we will bid our farewells. Thank you so much for taking time to join us in the midst of volcanic eruptions and all of that in Iceland. And we at Tarrant County College wish you the best as you finish up your PhD studies. And hopefully you'll join us in the future for another conversation on gaming and Japanese role-playing games. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was a real pleasure and an honor.
Thank you, Carter. You're so good at this. I also put the link in the chat to our 3:30 session. So we're going to go ahead and take a half-hour break, and we'll see you at 3:30 for Dr. Jared Willis's presentation on Woman Like Me, How Massively Multiplayer Online Role-Playing Games Virtually Reinforce Gendered, Racial, and Heterosexist Norms. So we'll see you guys in half an hour. Have a good one.
And that has been Nokkvi from the University of Iceland, talking about Japanese role-playing games, the kind of research he does, and about Birds of Play. Shortly, we will be listening to Dr. Jared Willis from the University of California at San Diego, and he will be talking about how MMORPGs virtually reinforce gendered, racial, and heterosexist norms. So have a good break, and I'll see you then.